Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. We're here this week with economist Stephen Gordon from Université Laval, and we've had a lot of interesting economic news in the last couple of weeks, and we just had an election where inflation was an issue, so I figured we'd chat about some of how to think about what's being said. So, Stephen, hi.
Hello.
So Friday we had jobs numbers that put us on a numerical level where we were before the pandemic started. And I just wonder if you can contextualize that a little bit.
Well, I mean, this is good. The recovery is continuing, but we really should hesitate and say we've mission accomplished back to normal. We're just transitioning from one set of very bad problems to perhaps a different set of not quite so bad problems. So we should be taking pleasure or whatever, being happy about these numbers, because of course it could be worse. But I mean, this is not it's never a time for complacency for these kinds of things.
For sure. And so where this kind of leads into is conversations about what this might mean for the Bank of Canada's guidance going forward. And as I was saying, we just had this election where inflation became an issue. Inflation is the Bank of Canada's entire mandate. So how does this start shaping the picture that they're putting together?
Well, there's two elements in this debate. One is what should the Bank of Canada's objectives be, like some broader, this broad set of objectives. Now, one thing you sort of quickly realize is that we do talk about the importance of the Bank of Canada being independent, and we'll get back to that. And I'll get back to that in a few minutes. But at some point, in a democracy, you can't leave the goals of policy to unelected technocrats. And so with the way we sort of deal with that tension between a desire for some sort of operational independence and democratic legitimacy is every 5 years, the Minister of Finance, who is the person who is ultimately in charge of the Bank of Canada, the Governor of the Bank of Canada reports to the Minister of Finance, gives a mandate of objectives that the Bank of Canada is supposed to follow, and the governor signs off on these. Since 1990 up until now, that mandate has been focused on inflation, 2%, and that mandate has been renewed over and over and over again. And the current mandate, 2%, is set to expire at the end of this year sometime.
Yeah.
There's no fixed date.
Yeah, so, and this is something I've noticed when I do some Bank of Canada coverage, is that they have been thinking about ways in which the government could consider changing that at the end of this year.
Yeah, I was very pleased about that, because in the previous iterations of the mandate, it's been very much an internal thing. But this time, the bank has made an effort to reach out to beyond the cloisters of the Bank of Canada, so that there's a little bit more engagement. I mean, of course, it's not something that a lot of people think a lot about. Even within economics, it's a bit of a niche field. So, but at least they're making an effort. And so there was that. I would have liked to have seen a bit more of that during the election campaign, about what the goals of monetary policy could be. I was a bit disappointed when Prime Minister Trudeau said that he didn't think about monetary policy. That's like, I mean, that actually was a good time to think about monetary policy. An election just before mandate renewal is a really good time to talk about and think about what monetary policy should be doing.
Yeah. So they are contemplating this renewal at this time. And there's a lot of forces for status quo. There are a few voices for things like dual mandate, or I think it's averaging.
Yeah, that's the one where basically, if errors are corrected. Right now, any deviations from the target are forgiven and forgotten. And under some kind of average, you'd sort of say, okay, if we're undershooting, we'll try to overshoot to catch up to the trend. or vice versa. So, like for example, like now inflation is above target, so they would say, all right, you should be trying to get below. Of course, you could also say that the reason we're above target now is that we were below target for so many years. So anyway, something like that. Yeah, some notion of fixing past mistakes.
All right, and I guess so. With this in mind, let's kind of have a bit of a think about how this conversation kind of played out over the course of the election, and how this kind of became a politicized thing when I don't know how fairly it should have been politicized in the way that it was.
Yeah. Well, we're here getting into the operations, and so we started thinking of to what extent politicians are second guessing the Bank of Canada's operational decisions. The operational decision at the bank was, when the crisis hit, was to buy a lot of government bonds, not just federal, provincial as well. And their reasoning that they said at the time, and we'll still say it and still say now, is that they just want to make sure that governments needed to borrow a lot of money right away, and they wanted to make sure that the markets just didn't collapse, because if the government says, okay, we need $300 billion right now, the market can't absorb that kind of a shock overnight. Mm-hmm. The Bank of Canada can't, and so the bank stepped in. So they're not necessarily. Of course, it actually does look very much like the Bank of Canada funded the debt, and in some sense, yes, that's true. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was basically to keep financial markets from melting down under the weight of this huge demand for borrowing.
And at the time as well, I mean, we suffered deflation in the early months of the pandemic as well.
Yeah. So like a lot of that was, we're not really sure exactly what happened, because there's a lot of supply problems, demand problems. So to some extent they sort of canceled out. I was expecting prices to actually go up, just because a lot of supply had been withdrawn, so there'd be shortages. Mm-hmm. But it turned out also that a lot of people were staying at home and incomes were cut, so demand fell down too. So it seems to have more or less canceled out. Now we're back. Now it looks like the case. We're seeing inflation drift above the target. The story here apparently is supply shortages, bottlenecks. We're seeing that like in China, the shipping costs from China to North America went way up, and these are things that will just feed back down into
mm-hmm. The Suez Canal back up, and then there's a huge backlog at the Port of Los Angeles right now, things like that. Yeah,
and so that's how the bank and a lot of analysts basically interpret this surge of inflation. And since, to the extent that these things are transitory, at some point things will get deblocked, and the supply chains will be reforged, and
they kind of work themselves out.
Yeah, and the thing is, the bank sort of does control inflation, but the levers, there's a famous expression, with long and variable lags. So basically, right now, what we're probably living with is the effects of the Bank of Canada's decision 18 months ago, the beginning of the pandemic, and so the bank can't really step in now to fix it, and it's not clear the bank would want to, because that means you'd have to go back in time and say, okay, we're actually going to let markets collapse, which would have been probably a much worse thing than having inflation a little bit above target right now. Mm-hmm.
And that is actually something I've been kind of curious about. What would have been the counterfactual if they hadn't stepped in? Like certain conservative politicians seem to think they shouldn't have.
Yeah, well, okay, then the thing is, the federal government would not have been able to send out checks. The federal government has a bank account. If there's not money in the bank account, it can't write a check. You have to, where would that money have come from? And you want to say, well, the private sector? I mean, it's not at all clear, because Canada was not the only government looking to spend a lot of money right away. the world financial markets, everybody, all governments were looking to borrow large sums of money right away. The counterfactual would be a huge spike in interest rates, or simply the government not able to carry out the sort of income maintenance programs that it ended up doing. That's how you do policy analysis. You have to think, okay, is this a good or bad policy? Well, compared to what? And if you can sort of go through compared to what, it's like, well, okay, spike in interest rates would be very, very bad. A government unable to help people during a once in a century pandemic would be even worse. So, inflation, tilting a couple of percentage points above target for a couple of months, probably not the worst case scenario.
Right.
So,
okay. And I guess with this in mind, you are a very vocal critic of these certain MPs who are politicizing the Bank of Canada. And I just want you to just kind of lay out why this is a problem for the country.
As I said, like the broad goals of monetary policy, definitely something politicians have been thinking and talking about. That's this is what in a democracy, the goals are set out by democratically elected governments, and having an opinion on that is, of course, this is what I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah.
But the effectiveness of monetary policy depends very much on operational autonomy. A parallel, okay, it's not exact, but it might sort of get the same idea. Is let's say criminal law, okay, the criminal, or in the courts.
Yeah.
Well, it's perfectly normal normal and just and correct for the government to make a law, politicians to propose laws, criticize laws. You don't want politicians going after the judges who are trying to execute and carry out these laws as best they can.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. People like Pierre Poilievre don't see. I mean, it's really hard to understand where he's going with his campaign. He doesn't seem to have any problem with the mandate as it is. Although maybe he wants the target to be lowered. I haven't actually heard him say something like that.
I keep asking this myself.
Yeah, and so I mean, if he just says he's talking about the inflation tax, then it's like, yes, we're well aware about the inflation tax. That's why the target is low. It's 2%. It's not zero for historical and technical reasons. One of them is that we know that the consumer price index generally overestimates inflation, and so like a 2% in the CPI is probably less than that in the true cost of living. So it's actually it's probably not really very far from zero anyway. So, but that's, as I say, that's a minor technical thing, and people do talk about it. Maybe we should go down to 1 there. But monetary policy is all about monetary economics is all what we call forward-looking. Everything depends on expectations. There are various classes of models where expectations become self-fulfilling. Mm-hmm. If you think that inflation is going to come, inflation comes. And so when the bank is saying we're going to do something, it has to be credible for it to be effective. One of the worst recession we had before this last one, up until now, we always say like the worst recession we had in Canada was in the early 1980s, when the Bank of Canada brought in started an anti-inflation campaign, and it was not believed because the Bank of Canada had always backed away at the last minute under political pressure. This time the bank held firm, and because it was not believed, we had the worst recession since the Great Depression. And so these kinds of things, the credibility, we learned a lot about the credibility of the Bank of Canada. If the bank says something, it has to be believed. In countries at the time, Great Britain, I think the interest rate set was still a cabinet decision. In places like that, a politician has lots of things to think about, and not least of them getting reelected. And so, raising interest rates is never going to be popular. And so, even if they actually do it, as I say, if it's not believed, it could have negative consequences. So we've learned that you can't leave the actual day-to-day operations to politicians, because it's not that they'll make bad decisions, it's just that no one will believe them.
Mm.
Because they say, okay, you're saying that now because right now, today you're talking about inflation, but next week you're going to be talking to somebody else, and they're going to want something else, and you're going to say something else to them.
Yeah,
who knows what you're going to actually do? And so this is why it's important for the bank to have like the operational independence. Like that's what happens now. The mandate is given, and after that, it's just the Bank of Canada, the Governor of Bank of Canada, has complete discretion to carry it out as he sees fit. There is the possibilities that if the government decides that the bank really is off track, the Minister of Finance is ultimately responsible, but there would be a formal, complaint or a directive.
There's a process.
There's a process, and part of that process is the governor resigning. This would be a very big deal. The last time we had the government forcing out a Bank of Canada governor, it was a big deal at the time. We ended up living with the consequences for another 10 years, and it was not good. It was something definitely to be avoided. And so this is why, and one of the reasons why we don't want governments and certainly politicians stepping in here. For here, like what these various conservative politicians are saying, it's like, we're announcing an attack on the Bank of Canada, and I don't know what the end game here is.
Yeah.
If they want, if they're saying that that under their government they would force the resignation of the Bank of Canada's governor, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Is he just saying, well, I'm just talking about, I'm just saying, like there's lots of people who would think that, the bank really should, be, let's say, slowing down, tapering its purchases of bonds more rapidly. I mean, lots of people will say things like that. But if a politician, an MP who actually aspires to be in government, these are not things that government people should be talking about, any more than he should be talking about a particular court case where somebody was either convicted or not convicted, and somehow going after the judge for that. That would be very bad.
Yeah.
So like the whole thing of putting in question our notion of independent justice or independent administration of, a policy.
All right. Well, that's been a lot to think about, and some really good context. And thanks for doing this. We'll do it again soon.
My pleasure.
All right.
Okay. Bye.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.